Hello and welcome to another ATP geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan M.S. Pierce. This is a Ukraine War Update extra video giving you the extra tidbits and juicy nuggets to give you a greater understanding of the war in Ukraine. Where should we start? There are quite a number of things I want to talk about today, and actually quite a few sort of long threads. I'm going to put one off to tomorrow, which is super interesting about China. That might take up arguably most of the video. Today, I'm going to start with Mark Hertling talking about why we didn't give stuff sooner and talking about this theory that I've actually proposed before, which is, again, for good reason, because Lloyd Austin said we want to degrade the Russians as much as possible. So the idea is that we're eking this out as long as possible to fully and utterly degrade Russia so they can never come back and do this again. Right? If we'd just given Ukraine everything straight away, that you'd had a short war, Russia would have been beaten back, but then they could have come back again, a few years later. And so this is the best way to fully cripple Russia. But Mark Hartling here says that actually that's not the reason we didn't give them the stuff earlier. These are the reasons, and so let's hear them out. They are pretty good. Just to remind you who he is, if you don't know, so he served as the commanding general of the United States Army Europe and the Seventh Army. Served in armor, cavalry, planning operations, and training positions, and commanded every organization from platoon to field army, etc., etc. Anyway, what's he say? So I put this information out that 2/3 of responses are why didn't we start giving them this equipment and training them on it earlier? For those asking those questions, let me reply with a few of my own that might help people consider the implications. Okay, so his questions are: how many Ukrainians do you think need training for these kind of operations? How many US servicemen will be needed to train them? On what specific pieces of equipment? Since the US doesn't have warehouses of unused military equipment ready to give away, where do we get it? What US taxpayer dollars have been allocated for building Ukraine an entire army filled with modern equipment? If we take the needed equipment from US military units, what risks are we taking in US national security around the globe? Most complex US equipment is not point and shoot. Where and how do we pull tens of thousands of Ukrainian soldiers to train as units before sending this stuff into Ukraine? After training the fighters, where do we get the added thousands of Ukrainian logisticians and maintainers to support? As you get a mix of allied equipment from various NATO nations to support Ukraine, how do you manage the spare parts, ammo, and training for each type of equipment? Who coordinates the plan for delivering different stuff from dozens of nations to make it easier on Ukraine? For all those saying, why didn't the West give all this stuff and start training on it months ago? Consider all the issues on the previous tweets, and now try and future what the situation will be in 6 months and what will be needed, and then ask the same questions as above. What Ukraine needs is a bevy of new and modern army, air force, and naval equipment. That takes a while. It also needs soldiers, and units of trained on that equipment and trained in the maintenance and logistics with the required spare parts, ammo, fuel, and other logistics. I'm sure there will be those who read the thread and say, who will now say, just give them everything they want right now. For those saying that, take a look at the questions, because that is what the US and NATO experts are working through. No one is slow rolling Ukraine. No one is trying to keep this war going. Everyone wants to save Ukrainian lives, but this stuff is harder and more complicated than most know. And actually, he's almost certainly right. I've been one thinking, right, because I can see the sense in that. I can see the sense in taking Russia out of the game for the long term, but I'm not sure that would be something they specifically planned, even if Lloyd Austin did say something to that effect. But that's a kind of generic term. We want to degrade Russia so they can never do this again. I think, yes, that's the intention anyway. But the primary intention is to have Ukraine winning the war. So it just takes an awful long time to get this stuff. As he says, it's not all this stuff isn't just sitting in warehouses ready to be sent to Ukraine on a big fat plane, and then everyone knows what to do with it. What Ukraine has been trained on and what it has received since February of last year is phenomenal. I mean, that's an incredible achievement. Um, Okay, moving on. So this is I just did a live interview with Tim White. Really great interview. Please check it out. That's on my Atypical Philosopher channel, and we talked all about Ukraine. He's just returned from Ukraine, done some filming out there. Please check Tim White's interview out. But he has posted this on his feed, but many people have. So there was okay. What's the context? Makiivka was hit with HIMARS. It's sort of technical college educational building, 3 or 4 stories high basement. It was also storing a shed load of ammunition, but around about 600 Russian soldiers were there, predominantly, as is claimed, mobilized troops. They were all sheltering there because they're being brought to the front line. You've got to put them somewhere, but it's within HIMARS range, and they billeted them next to ammunition. This gets hit by HIMARS, and the Ukrainians claim 600 people or so were killed or wounded. There's also the claim that it happened because it happened just after New Year's was sort of seen in, and they were all apparently watching Putin on a big screen in this accommodation. So they were all uh, crowded together, and the whole building was turned to rubble. It was just a death scene. So anyway, what happened is Russia denied this. You get the pro-Russian bots on my thread saying, "Oh, that nothing happened. It was blah blah blah." And TASS reported that 15 were injured, and then the Russian MOD said, "Actually, we got about 20 dead." And then it was like 63 dead, and then it was 69, then it was 89, and then they said yesterday, I think, okay, we're not going to tell you how many people died there because we don't want foreign um, intelligence agencies, using it as provocation. In other words, they pretty much accepted that up to 600 people were killed or wounded. But the pro-Russian narrative and these pro-Russian people on the threads are like, no, you don't know that many died, blah blah blah. No, they didn't die. It's all a load of rubbish. And then we started hearing reports of bodies being left on the side of the road that have fallen off the trucks that were so full of bodies that they were falling off the trucks. And then there was that report, and there was photographic evidence of that. And then Russia retaliated by hitting Druzhkivka with missile strikes. Uh, and claiming that 600 people died, which is kind of a tacit admission that 600 people had just died in Makiivka, if you're saying that you've hit this new place, and then luckily 600 people have died. So there's that. And then they said we've definitely hit the HIMARS that did this damage. Like, you can't track a HIMARS like that. You don't know where they are. You've claimed to have blown up more HIMARS than actually exist in Ukraine. So you don't know what you're talking about. And then they claim to have hit Kramatorsk and killed another 600 people. And then there's photographic evidence that didn't happen. And then there's independent attestation from independent journalists saying that we've been around. The missiles didn't even hit the building. They landed outside. You've only got broken windows. There's no blood, no dead bodies. On all the locals, someone reported that they hurt their finger because the explosion, was so woke them up in the middle of the night or whatever. It's like, no, this isn't 600 people died. So anyway, what I'm doing is the Ukrainian narrative appears to be fairly accurate and is being borne out by subsequent evidence, and the Russian narrative is demonstrably false. On 2 occasions, that's supposed to be of parity with the original Makiivka accident. This whole thing is super important. The reason I'm belaboring the point here is this is super important. So when people on the threads below say, "Oh, Ukrainians, why are you listening to Ukrainian statistics? They're a load of rubbish, and Russian statistics are far more accurate." I was arguing with someone yesterday who said, like, "Oh, I've come to the conclusion that Russian statistics are more accurate." Okay, brilliant. Thanks, Russian bot. Where's your evidence for that? Substantiate your point. Here's some evidence. I'm substantiating my claim here that Ukrainian statistics are more um, reliable. Okay, this is just one example, but there are plenty like this. And then to add to this, there's this intercept. Of course, pro-Russians will say, "Oh, this is propaganda." Okay, it could be, but we've got pretty good evidence to suggest that these intercepts are genuine. They appear all of the intercepts we previously had appear to have been genuine. There's no good reason to think they're fake, unless there's some seriously good actors doing this. But here is a guy that said they were involved in clearing up all the bodies, that there were 12 well, there are various, I've seen 22 truckloads, I've seen 12 truckloads, but a load of Kamaz trucks were used to get rid of the dead bodies, and the claim was there are 610 dead. So what appears to be going on in this phone call is a woman speaking to someone else over the phone, and she is reporting what Sergey, Elena's husband, has told her. So he is this guy that they're talking about who is transporting dead bodies in Kamaz trucks. He has said that there's 610 dead. So here's a quote from what we're about to hear. He personally transported the bodies from Makiivka. He says there were 610 dead in Makiivka, 12 Kamaz trucks loaded. And let's play this. Regular soldiers of the Russian Federation confirmed the losses of mobilized soldiers in Makiivka, refuting all the official Russian propaganda. So this is her speaking. I'll mute it in a second so people who listen to me as audio can hear what's going on rather than them having to stop and watch the screen and read. I'll read out the subtitles. So in short, she says, Sergey, Elena's husband, called. He personally transported the bodies of these soldiers from Makiivka and from from the second one where the hospital is. In short, according to him, there are 610 dead soldiers in Makiivka. He says he took out 12 Kamaz trucks. I told you that, and you tell me, no, there were only 63. Then why are the effing authorities keeping silent about this fact? And the reply is so that no one riots, damn it. Or maybe that's what she says. Elena says that Sergey is sitting and clutching his head and that he says that he feels bad and does not know what to do. He sits crying because his friend died there in the hospital when the hospital was bombed. Damn, enough about that. I'm calling you to clear my effing head. And you're giving me bad news, says the other person. Nothing's changed. We're finishing eating effing salads. I didn't sleep through Putin's speech, the most effed up speech that I've ever seen. Yeah, F yeah. Do you remember Oksana's son? You told he was admitted to the hospital with a contusion with a broken eye socket. This effing idiot decided to drink beer on New Year. Well, he was caught in the act by some captain, and as you think, he wasn't cured. With a severe concussion, a broken effing eye socket, he was sent back to the position. They say, you effing violated the regime. Oh God, when will it end? Someday. Someday. You know, is that 100% proof that Makiivka happened? No, it's not. But you add it in to the jigsaw puzzle that builds up a picture that Makiivka took place. And then we have all the evidence. And I did a whole video on Druzhkivka not happening, as the Russians claim. And there is plenty of evidence reported by Reuters and other news organizations that Kramatorsk didn't happen. So there you go. Russians lie. Igor Strelkov, who is a military blogger in Russia who went to fight on the front lines and came back and was in fact in charge of the militias in the 2014 separatist movement. He is becoming more and more outspoken in terms of his views on Putin. And this is very telling. This is just one of a whole bunch of things he said. I'll just read this one. It's fascinating. It's really critical of Putin. So he says, tell the political scientist Markov that for more than 8 years, the Supreme Commander-in-Chief had no desire to use my abilities in any way. So he's obviously feeling somewhat insulted. Moreover, the President and Supreme Commander-in-Chief for 9 years in a row acted exactly the opposite of what I asked and begged to do. To this day, this situation has not changed one iota. Russia is on the verge of military defeat, interesting admission there, and no capture of small towns and villages changes the situation. Solidar, Bakhmut. And not only mediocre generals and mercenary officials should be responsible for this, but also the commander-in-chief who appointed them and stubbornly refuses to change them, Putin. I am against the change of commander-in-chief during the war, so I don't want Putin removed, but the absence of criticism cannot prevent or even delay catastrophe. If my criticism becomes suicidal for me, but it is noticed and causes at least some correct reaction, I will consider my duty fulfilled, because otherwise I'm not allowed to fulfill it, quote, from the word in any way. So he's basically been really critical of Putin and saying, well, I might die as a result of this, but as long as some good comes of it, then I've done my duty. But he is not happy with Putin and sees the military situation really for what it is, which is Russia losing this. And yeah, they may make the odd gain here and there. May end up being a victory for them. But is that really representative of the whole front line? Is that representative of the overall winning strategy of Russia? No, not as according to Igor Strelkov or Girkin. This is something I hadn't heard about. Fascinating stuff, and an interesting bit of debate you can have around this, bit of philosophy you can have around this, I guess, a bit of a moral debate about what is a war crime. So this is a bit of open source intelligence investigation that's been done. So more than 80 Russians were killed during a Ukrainian HIMARS strike on a school in occupied Lancetivka, Luhansk Oblast of Ukraine. Not Mobics, but civilian contractors who came there to dig trenches and build fortifications. Here's a thread about our new OSINT investigation. So the strike on Lantrativka happened on December the 16th at 3 to 4 a.m. in the morning. Three Gimler's rockets nearly destroyed the building. LPR authorities reported 11 civilian casualties. The village is 20 kilometers from the Russian border and 30 kilometers from Ukrainian positions. So here it is. This is actually fairly to the north. As far as I can work out, this is going to be Kupiansk down there. So this is the Vilshana Poshetravnevi grey zone, as they see it. You've got Dvorichna there, and Lantrativka, which is, presume this is the railway line that then goes down to Svata. No, it might be that would be Starobilsk. That'd be further to the east here, maybe. This looks like it's the road that comes down then from Troitska. There's the railway that goes from Troitska. I think that is the railway, the black one. So anyway, that's where it is, really to the north there. And that gives you an idea geographically. Confirmed geolocation of the strike. And here are some pictures and a geolocation there. So this is all, kind of above board OSINT intelligence work. On Sunday, January the 8th, Ukrainian blogger Anatoly Shary published a video from the school filmed before the strike. First, he called the strike Second Makiivka, where several hundreds of Russian Mobics were killed. Later on, Shary resorted to a new theory that a civilian contractors hired to dig trenches for Russian troops were lodged in the school. We found photos of the trenches on VK and geolocated them near Lantrativka. So what we have is a claim that you got civilian contractors who were actually killed in this HIMARS strike. So in order to prove that, let's actually look for the work they were doing. They found a whole bunch of trenches being built in the area. These trenches and fortifications can be seen on PlanetSat images too, and they appeared there between November the 15th and December the 5th. So this fits in with the time frame as well. Original Planet images from November the 15th to December the 5th and January the 8th. We spoke to the man who posted the trenches photos. He told us he came from Russia after seeing an ad on social media. Ads recruiting people to dig trenches in Donbass were reported back in December, and here's evidence of an advert attracting people to do this kind of contractor work in the Donbass, in the occupied territories. This guy was lucky. His employer, Stroycom company, lodged them not in Lantrivka, but in Valyuki, in nearby Belgorod region of Russia. So actually, his bunch were stationed in Russia and not in Luhansk. So just to give you an idea, here it is on a map. Yeah, that's a train line. So the train line goes through there. The road comes down. Troitska's there. Lantrivka's there. This is where the HIMARS strike hit. These guys were building trenches, but some of the people who were building trenches were being billeted up north in Russia. Okay. In nearby Belgorod region of Russia, every day they were brought to dig trenches on buses. We geolocated the place where those workers stayed in Belgorod, former Sakura restaurant and club. Geolocation of this place that was linked to pictures of them in their dormitories that you can see the same kind of fan units. I mean, this is good geolocation, good pieces of open source intelligence investigation. So this worker told us that most casualties in Lantrativka strike were workers too. Two buses from Novosibirsk, came at the same time we did. Roofers, carpenters, 3 HIMARS rockets, 11 official casualties, 84 unofficial. He shared a previously unpublished photo of the aftermath of the strike, which he received from one of his friends. quote, "Master's room have been completely blown to shreds," he says. "Unfortunately, we were not able to confirm 84 casualties figure independently." So that's the OSINT talking there. So the claim from some of the guys working there is that, yeah, you might have heard that 11 people officially died, civilians, but it was actually 84. So that's a Russian saying, look, the Ukrainians have hit civilians. They've killed some. But of course, if they tell the world that many civilians were killed, they have to then start explaining why they were killed and what they were doing there in occupied Ukraine. And it turns out they're just shipping in contractors, and we're just about to find out those contractors didn't even know they were in Ukraine. So we also found other photos and videos of the trenches in that area. Some workers seem to be armed with the AK, so a worker armed with an AK-40 or an AK rifle. Mudwatch Season 3, so pretty muddy around there. On this video, one below, another worker says that people from different professions gathered together to dig trenches, from carpenters to plumbers. "Where the F are we?" the narrator asks on this video. So literally, they're asking where they are. In Ukraine, guys, so watch yourself. They didn't even know they're in Ukraine. Obviously, they're just over the border in Russia. So crossing the border, especially when this is all occupied Russian territory anyway, is kind of like, you wouldn't know you'd done it. Our guy told us recently they were evacuated from Makiivka and their jobs were terminated, quote, because fighting started in that area. He says after the HIMARS strike, he's afraid to come back to Ukraine. What about salaries? It's worthy to risk life by digging trenches on the occupied Ukrainian land? Yes, they received, well, it depends on what your opinion is. They received $90 for a 10-hour shift, which is not bad at all for Russia. Stroycom still hires people for jobs like this to dig trenches and build fortifications in occupied parts of the Zaporizhia region. The company, by the way, participated in construction of the infamous Crimea Bridge. Another disputed question is if these civilian contractors can be qualified as legitimate military targets. Now, this is a crux of the matter. And this guy says that in the case with trenches, the answer is probably yes, because this kind of job is an effective contribution to military action. So whether the Ukrainians knew that these guys were contractors or not is one question. But even if they did know they're civilian contractors and hit them, these guys are actually arguably still legitimate military targets, as according to classifications of war crimes. So anyway, just a really fascinating thread. The original story is there. It can be read in Russian, I guess, rather than Ukrainian. But it's there. You can find that at svoboda.org. Let's go on to something else. This is a Ukrainian Grad multiple launch rocket system. So sending up sort of ballistic rockets, unguided. But it's getting destroyed by Russian Lancet. And this does look recent. You can tell by the weather, but it's winter. The reason I'm showing you this is to show that these Lancets are obviously still a nuisance and they are still doing damage to Ukrainian pieces of equipment. And that it would be really nice if they had lots of weapons to be able to take these Lancet drones out. Now, question here is, does it destroy this vehicle? Does it take it out of use? There's no secondary explosion, or at least the camera doesn't show it, which would indicate that if there was a big explosion, you can bet they'd keep that rolling. But there isn't, so the drone explodes. I would imagine that doesn't cause an awful lot of damage, and that's probably easily repairable. We've seen some Lancets hit before that have caused virtually no damage at all. One flat tire to a howitzer on one of the videos I showed. So you really need to hit the right places for these and get a bit of a lucky break for this kind of drone, which has only limited explosive capability to really properly take the vehicle out long term. Okay, I'm going to go on to another really important thread here. This is a thread on artillery, ammunition shells, and Russians running out. So this is from Phillips O'Brien, but he's referring to a CNN story. A really interesting story in CNN. US sources say that our Russian artillery fire is now far lower than this summer as much as 75% lower. So they're firing 25% of the rate they were previously. US and Ukraine have slightly different estimates, but regardless, Russian artillery fire is way down. In the US view, the Russians are down to firing 5,000 shells a day on average, which would actually mean Russia is firing fewer than Ukraine some days. Now, bearing in mind they were firing 60,000. I mean, I'm not even sure that's quarter. 5,000 of 60,000 is what, a twelfth? So yeah, that's a fraction of what they were. It seems to be a confluence of factors. Russian stockpiles were not nearly as large as we were led to believe. Those stockpiles were inefficiently stored, and Ukrainian attacks on Russian stockpiles and logistics have all taken a toll. So that is so three issues. They claimed they had, or we thought they had, this shed massive load of uh, artillery ammunition that had been collected over tens and tens of years. There's a very different way of doing things the Russians have as the Americans, which is a kind of just in time. Okay, we need these. There's no point in peacetime spending loads and loads of money stockpiling stuff and spending money on this. NATO and the West. We've got education to spend money on. We've got this and that. Whereas the Russians are like, right, we could be going to war at any point in time. We need to have a massive stockpile just in case we have a fight against NATO next week. So they have these huge stockpiles, but we thought they had stockpiles that could keep them going for a massive amount of time. It turns out that just wasn't true, and or the idea that the stockpiles they did have were inefficiently stored. So some of those artillery shells were not in good enough state to be fired. So then you've lost a lot from there, and that they just used up a load as well. So if Russian fire really is this low, it reinforces how counterproductive their continuing assaults on Soledar and Bakhmut are. They would be putting a great deal of their declining artillery strength into attacking towns of no strategic importance. This would then leave them precious little to try to disrupt Ukrainian attempts to organize and their next offensive, which should be a Russian priority, but is seemingly not. There's this kind of tension here between, right, either we prepare for them to go on the offense, in which case we have a defensive mindset and everything is tuned towards like not losing ground. This is the same consideration for the Ukrainians, by the way. Or we, as a Russians, go on the offensive, because if we go on the offensive, then that forces the Ukrainians to go on the defensive, which means that they can't consider their own offensives. So actually, us going on an offensive is a form of doing defense as well. So I think that's possibly the kind of thought process is going on here. But if they are running out of artillery rounds in a serious way, like even if Bakhmut falls, as I keep saying, they are going to culminate because they yes, this is you need to take Bakhmut if operationally you've got an objective of taking this area, or more so Kramatorsk, Slovyansk, and further north of Siversk, but to keep Kremina in in occupied hands, then in Russian hands. And if this is your operational objective, then you absolutely need Bakhmut. But the problem is, yeah, okay, you may get Bakhmut, but at what cost? Not just in terms of human lives, but in terms of ammunition stockpiles. Where do you go if you've got no ability to continue? If you really have culminated, as the ISW keeps saying, the Russians are doing in Bakhmut. So actually, the gains in Bakhmut haven't been made from artillery gains. The gains haven't been made by flattening the towns, as you have seen. Yes, Soledar has been flattened, and Bakhmut to some extent, but that's happened over months and months and months. In the last week, you've seen Russian gains from throwing huge amounts of people at the problem, uh, which means that if you're going to talk about continuing that momentum from a Russian's point of view, they are going to be unable to do so if they have no offensive capabilities because they're down to firing 5,000 shells a day across their whole front line. If that is true, they are in trouble. Also, a strong quote from Ben Hodges, I think that is General Ben, about the ludicrousness of the escalation debate. Points out that only a few months ago, giving stingers was being said to be escalatory by some. Yeah, the escalation debate I think is over now, and I think the West and NATO are pretty much prepared to give anything to to the Ukrainians. It's a case of what can we do to help them win rather than what can we do to stop them losing. Now, my next thing isn't about slagging Elon Musk off again, but it's just an interesting talking point here. So, Elon Musk got involved in a big old Twitter spat again by saying something that showed that he doesn't really know what he's talking about in terms of tanks and stuff, which is absolutely fine. That's fine. Elon Musk sparks a heated debate on Twitter saying Ukraine shouldn't use tanks against Russia. This is the Independent reporting this. So Musk said, tanks are a death trap now, tweeted Mr. Musk before drawing parallels from the First World War. With neither side having air superiority, you're left with infantry and artillery, essentially World War One. And he was basically talking about how you can use little drones to drop munitions down on tanks, and and then sees tanks as being completely useless because actually is you can just use cheap armaments against them, so there's no point in having them on the battlefield type thing. So that's a brief synopsis of the kind of conversation that went on. So Mark Hartling got involved, all these sort of Phillips O'Brien, all these people that I follow got involved in this discussion and sort of piled on to Elon Musk saying basically actually you don't know what you're talking about. So if you don't know what you're talking about here, it's probably safer not to say anything, which is fair enough. Trent Telenko, who's a logistics expert, took a different position. He said he doesn't know what he's talking about. Yeah, fair enough. But this is a good teachable moment. So it's too useful. So a whole lot of people have dunked on Elon Musk for this. I'm not. It's too useful as a teachable moment on how smart people can get things wrong because they lack the proper context to understand what they're seeing in videos. This is a tank logistics thread. So, yeah. Trent Telenko says there are a lot of military analysts who think the same thing as Elon Musk about tanks after seeing little quadcopter drones kill hundreds of tanks and light armored fighting vehicles with cheap grenades. Those videos lack logistical context. So Rob Lee has the tank and AFV, so armored fighting vehicles, so that's tanks and IFVs and all sorts, logistical context in the tweet below. So this tweet below is, in the majority of videos in which a drone destroys a tank by dropping a munition on it, and I've seen maybe 100 of these videos. Especially after the first month, the tank was already abandoned or immobilized. The weapons that immobilize them are more expensive. COTS, commercial off-the-shelf drones, dropping grenades are not replacing, anti-tank systems. So what he's saying here is that, and this is absolutely true, virtually every one of those tanks that has an IED drop from a drone through its hatch, it's got open hatches, it's not moving, there's no one there. Those tanks have been abandoned. They're either damaged and immobilized or they run out of fuel. This happened all over Ukraine, particularly in the first few months of the war. Trent Telenko says just like Russia was short of trucks in its rear service, it was also short of armored recovery vehicles. So what Trent Telenko is saying here is this teaches us something. What it teaches us is that the question we need to ask is why were there so many abandoned IFVs and abandoned tanks? And it's because actually the Russians had no capability of removing those tanks from the field. So without that capability, the Russian crew members just got out and ran away. So the Ukrainians systematically blew up abandoned tanks and airfields with drones. And I've seen this with my own eyes, and I know they're abandoned. The tactic isn't new. The lack of US Army M31 and M32 tank retrievers during the Operation Iceberg invasion of Okinawa Second World War, was one of the major logistical failures left out of the US Army's Okinawa, the last battle. See the USMC M32 recovery tank at Okinawa below left. When you go to the Ordnance Department on Beachhead and Battlefront by Lisa Mayer, that's a book, you will find the good stuff on the massive tank recovery vehicle logistical failure at Okinawa. We are seeing in Ukraine now what the US Army suffered in Okinawa from April to June 1945. Basically, not enough tank recovery vehicles to do an adequate job of getting them out there. This 10th Army After Action report goes more deeply into why the tank recovery vehicles were missing. 10th Army asked for them too late to get more than 6 for the 713th Flame Tank Battalion. In the aftermath of the Ardennes offensive in Europe, most available M32 tank recovery vehicle production was either on boats or rails to Europe. USMC tank production was separate from the US Army, and they got theirs while the Pacific US Army was hung out to dry by the War Department. This was why the institutional historians of the US Army's Okinawa The Last Battle left that out of the book. Logistics are everything in war other than shooting and fighting. It is also the context most often left out because the usual reasons. In other words, he doesn't go into the details of why Russia don't have those tank recovery vehicles, but the fact that you are seeing drones drop munitions on tanks and blowing them up, and them sitting there with open hatches not moving, is because they don't have the ability to remove those tanks from the battlefield after they become inoperable for whatever reason. And for whatever reason that they don't have those particular types of armored vehicles, recovery vehicles, who knows? But they don't have them. That's what this tells us. And these are easy hits for the Ukrainians to make. I mean, it would be even nicer if those vehicles were sometimes not behind enemy lines, so you don't have to drop drones on them. You can just go and pick them up. And in fact, that's what happened an awful lot. There, in the first 6 months of the war, there was, the Russians were basically donating a whole load of equipment to the Ukrainians, and the Ukrainians are like, "Thank you very much." So this isn't me dunking on Elon Musk, but it's more to actually show you what really was taking place. And there are a lot of people that think that those tanks were genuinely blown up with crews in, and those are drones taking out tanks. No, it's not. It's drones dropping a bunch of munitions through an empty hatch, and that sometimes cooking off some of the ammunition inside, but often you just see them blow up the inside, and nothing really happens. It's just like that tank is unusable from now on. The controls will be wrecked. There is something I want to add in that's just sort of come through, filtered through the news sources, and that is that, well, first of all, Poland and Lithuania have got together and they've come to some agreement with Ukraine where they're going to provide a platoon of Leopard 2 tanks. That's 14 Leopard 2 tanks, which is fantastic. The dam is broken, but perhaps just before that, I'm unsure of the timing here, but the UK government, and I'm not sure this is fully official yet, it might be by the time you receive this, has apparently confirmed to plans to send main battle tanks, most likely Challenger 2, equipped with second generation Chobham armor, to Ukraine. This is an important milestone. No NATO country has so far sent Western-made MBTs to Ukraine. So the dam has broken. Stuff is happening. It is looking pretty good for sending offensive equipment that is decent to Ukraine. Now, we'll have to wait to see how that materializes, what happens. But here's something that could be worth bearing in mind, could be what is happening. I don't know. Just someone adding 2 and 2 to make 4, but it could be 5. No report says a follower tipped me off on this one, so I decided to follow it. A USAF, so US Air Force Strategic Transport Aircraft, Globemaster 3, departed from Jordan and has just landed at Glasgow Prestwick Airport, and which also does military ground handling. US Air Force actively uses this airport. So Prestwick is in Scotland, Jordan's in the Middle East. What's going on there? Now, just a thought, Jordan owns 400 Challenger 1 tanks that have been upgraded to Al Hussein variant that it bought from England in 2000. Jordan has confirmed that these will be withdrawn. Could this plane possibly carry a Challenger 1 tank in order to train Ukrainian troops stationed in England? Challenger 1 tanks have less technology and are easier for Ukrainian troops to master than the upgraded Challenger 2. In addition, I can imagine, says Noel Reports, that Jordan would be happy to sell to Ukraine to cover part of the funding for the B-1 Centauro and M1A3 Mardas that will replace them. Interesting. And someone replies to that, there's a lot of military activity at Prestwick. The Canadians have based 3 C-130s there, which do regular runs with weapons and supplies. It is very heavily used by USAF, Canada, Australia, Israel, UAE, Kuwait, and the UK to transfer supplies. And also that routing suspiciously looks like military routing when they're carrying cargo, keeping away from non-NATO countries, Serbia, and countries that are notoriously difficult to get overflight rights for example, Austria. So the flight path of that looks very much military. And it is could well, it could be that the Challenger 1 might end up in Ukraine and not the Challenger 2. And if it is easier to use, I mean, that's a good way. You don't want to get rid of rubbish like stuff that no one wants to Ukraine. You want to give them decent stuff. Challenger 1s, I would assume, would still be a great advantage over some of the Soviet era tanks that they'll be fielded against. So, depending on what the upgrade looks like, and I have to look into that the Challenger 1s could be a really viable option rather than the Challenger 2. But either way, it looks like something's coming from the UK. That dam has broken, and we are starting to see offensive weapons, main battle tanks, Leopard 2s going there. Poland are really doing a great job in supporting Ukraine. So that's fantastic to see. There you go. Anyway, hopefully that was all useful and interesting for you. Thanks for your support. Please like, subscribe, and share. All the ways you can support the channel in the description below. You can buy my books. That'd be lovely. Or you just buy me a coffee or whatever. Or you just watch this. It's totally up to yourself. Obviously, it's a free world. Luckily for us, not for those in the occupied regions of Ukraine. So spare a thought for them. Anyway, thank you. Take care. I'll speak to you tomorrow.